This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, debuting in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Hello, I'm BioCentury's Washington editor, Steve Usdin. I'm pleased to be joined today by Gillian Woollett, Head of Regulatory Strategy and Policy at Samsung Bioepis, a global biosimilars manufacturer. Gillian, I've been reporting about biosimilars since before there were biosimilars, and you've been in the field really pushing it forward from the beginning. You were involved with the approval of the first U.S. biosimilar, Omnitrope, which was approved before FDA had a biosimilars pathway, so it wasn't even called a biosimilar. That was in 2006. The vision for biosimilars was that they would become a tool to enforce the social contract. Biologic drugs would have a certain period of exclusivity, patents would expire, and then bingo, biosimilar competition would lower prices and improve access. This would stimulate more innovation as companies develop new products to replace those that lost exclusivity. It would create headroom for new medicines because the very high costs of biologics would be reduced. And the expectation was this would be the norm for almost all biologics. Fast forward about 20 years, and it hasn't really played out that way. Regulatory and commercial barriers have limited biosimilars competition to a shadow of what it could be. Now, FDA and regulators around the world are converging in ideas, many of them that you've been proposing for a long time, to reduce unnecessary barriers to developing biosimilars. At the same time, in the US, the government has made the business side of the equation even more challenging. So let's start with the easy part, science and regulation. FDA Commissioner Marty Makary and CBER Director Vinay Prasad say they want to massively streamline the biosimilars pathway. I assume that that's going to include eliminating the presumption that clinical trials will be conducted to demonstrate efficacy. How much money and time would that save?
It varies a lot between different products. I think we have to bear that in mind, that different therapeutic areas, different products can behave very differently. But essentially, the biotech industry is monoclonal antibodies. And monoclonal antibodies are very, very well understood at this point. So I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to say we could half the time and half the cost if we were to optimize development. Now, that may give us more entrance. So I look at before the fulcrum of approval, and post-approval is you need adoption and market share. But if we're looking at development, it would make a huge difference to have the regulatory predictability of knowing you don't need to do a comparative clinical efficacy study. We have a great precedent. It's called comparability in support of manufacturing changes, where we don't do clinical studies at all. So it doesn't change the quality, safety, and efficacy of the product that's approved. And it's very, very timely to consider it now when the word efficiency is in fashion in Washington.
So, you say have the time and have the cost. So we're talking about maybe shaving 4 years and maybe $100 million off. Is that right?
Again, I always say that the rough equation is that a biosimilar is going to cost you 100 times the cost of the average generic to get to market. 100, 300 million versus 1 to 3. We're talking 7 to 10 years, maybe tough to half the entire time. But I think the opportunity is there. And given that we know that fully 90% of the biologics facing loss of exclusivity within the next 10 years have no biosimilars in development at all, halving the time is as important as halving the cost, because we could maybe reconsider some of those products within that non-existent pipeline.
Yeah, and I want to get to that later. But let's stick with this just a moment longer, because I think it's hard for people who aren't familiar with biosimilars, including physicians, right, and patients, to understand why large-scale efficacy trials aren't necessary. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's fairly easy to answer, because the analytics, even back in '96 when we developed comparability, were enough to show if a product is comparable, the terminology, to a pre-manufacturing change product. So we were comparing products using so-called critical product quality attributes, CQAs, and we were defining the product analytically. That was the key step in the late 90s, with the analytics being good enough to know if your product was the same pre-post manufacturing change. Those same analytics have got even better. But my argument would be they don't need to be even better when the originator reference product is already a biosimilar to itself based on those methods. Now, those analytics and increasingly functional assays, such as binding assays in vitro, are way more sensible than any feasible clinical comparative study in actual people. And I always go, I'm so aggressive, I go to the Declaration of Helsinki. We shouldn't be ever experimenting on human beings if we're not getting regulatorily relevant data that is the basis of the approval. So those studies cannot tell us anything because their sensitivity is inherently not there compared to the analytics. And that's very, very important as we move forward. Another argument is we shouldn't do clinicals because those very patients should have the opportunity to be in studies for the next generation of originator products. So there's a lot of reasons not to be doing the clinicals, but the fundamental one is they can't tell us anything new.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I looked at a report from the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program. It was put out in 2019, and they said that regulators could not recall any experiences in which a clinical efficacy study led to rejection of a biosimilar application or was used to resolve residual uncertainty that remained after a complete comparative quality and PK assessment. So like you say, they're not really doing much good. Okay, so that's one step. Another thing regulators could do, I think, is to create a single agreement on a single global reference product that biosimilar candidates would be compared against. Is that something that would be useful? Is that something that would be viable?
I think so. And this is where the lawyers and the scientists argue and both blame the politicians, right? So each country has its own laws that say you have to make a biosimilar to that country's reference product. But what we already have, and we published in the peer-reviewed literature in 2017, is the originator product that's being used as the reference is approved in every jurisdiction based on the same pivotal clinical studies. Ergo, it is the same product. And there is a citizen petition at the FDA on so-called three-way PK. So the public data from the websites of, say, EMA, the European regulators, FDA, the US regulators, already identify those clinical studies that show the originator is the same. So to put it simply, if you have a global reference product that's the brand that the biosimilars are being made to, of course you should be able to have a global biosimilar too. And this is it's called single global development. And again, we need to line up the ducks as a legal matter, as a science matter. But yes, it's doable and it should be possible to do it today.
And it will reduce a lot of unnecessary development work, reduce the costs, reduce the times.
And increase the access.
And increase the access around the world, yeah. Which
is ultimately what it's about. Biosimilars are about access through affordability and competition. What could be more American?
So when Scott Gottlieb was FDA commissioner, he called out the manufacturers of original biologic drugs for impeding biosimilars development. He said, for example, that they make it hard to acquire reference samples, and they undertake other anti-competitive strategies. Is that still a problem?
It's a mixed bag. And I think part of it, when you mentioned earlier on the, healthcare providers, patients, and some of the confusion around biosimilars, and that'll get into interchangeability, it becomes semantics. At one point I said, well, let's call them biosames then, and we've solved the problem of being similar and not the same. And that's not to be entirely facetious, because the perception that an interchangeable is a better biosimilar and some of this innuendo continues to create concerns. And I think for physicians and their patients, they're not into analytics. And if you're ask a clinical question, that's why you expect a clinical study, because you think it has to be a clinical answer. So it continues, perhaps not as bad as it was, but what we've ended up having occur is if you can use the biosimilar to leverage the price of the originator, but use the originator anyway, it makes it easier for all those healthcare providers. The trouble is that doesn't make the biosimilars industry feasible. And we've
Yeah,
got, let alone sustainable.
So we're going to get into the economics of it, and that's one of the key issues, because I think that the economic barriers are actually more difficult to surmount than the scientific and regulatory ones. But one more question on the regulatory side, and then we'll switch over to the economics. You mentioned it, interchangeability. There's a lot of confusion around this. When Congress created the biosimilars pathway in the United States, they thought they were doing the industry a big favor by creating an interchangeability designation and creating some kind of incentives for companies to do that. It hasn't really worked out that way. What does interchangeability mean in the context of biosimilars, and is it important?
So interchangeability is a designation by FDA that the state pharmacy boards can recognize in the manner of generics, such that pharmacists can substitute without a new prescription being issued. So it looked like it was going to be a way to get more biosimilars more readily available without impinging on new prescriptions. However, most biosimilars don't go through the pharmacy anyway. And there were various aspects of exclusivity that made it complicated. So as I look at it, every biosimilar is interchangeable, whether or not it's designated as such. And this is where FDA is now saying we don't need the distinction, and they're not asking for the switching studies. So we are the only country in the world that has the separate designation. In Europe, they've used the word in the more common English term to say every biosimilar is interchangeable, but it's up to each health authority how they treat that and whether they allow pharmacy-based substitution, which most of the time in Europe they don't, because the decision is made by a central authority what they're going to purchase anyway. So it's created this concern, and physicians think an interchangeable is a better biosimilar. It's not. It's the same product on which additional studies may or may not have been done to allow the pharmacist to dispense. It's a dispensing issue. It's not a prescribing issue.
And you mentioned switching studies, and that's another example of this kind of studies that some would argue are unnecessary or perhaps even unethical, where you're switching patients back and forth among different products to demonstrate that they don't have any different or discernible differences in their clinical effects.
And again, FDA did a massive study, a Hendren paper that they published in the peer-reviewed literature, looking at all the switches that are being done and shown that there's absolutely no difference in the clinical outcomes. And this is important because the regulators are the ones that have access to the most information. So not only did they address switching with the reference as not changing the clinical outcomes, switching between different biosimilars to that same reference do not change the clinical outcomes either. So I think patients, healthcare providers can be very, very much assured. Now, it's a dense paper. Most healthcare providers and probably very, very few patients are ever going to read it. But that FDA did that study comprehensively is very, very important.
So we're going to take a quick break now. And when we come back, we're going to go get to the hard part. We're going to talk about the economics and the changing economics of biosimilars.
Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
So I'm back with Gillian Woollett talking about biosimilars. You said at the top of the program, I think, that 90% of biologic drugs don't have any biosimilar that's on track to compete with them when they lose their patent exclusivity. Some of that's down to the regulatory barriers that we talked about, but a lot of it is commercial issues. What are the barriers? Why aren't we seeing a lot more biosimilar development?
So we don't have healthcare systems, particularly in the US, and I shouldn't use the word systems, it's more a collection of industries. We don't have a setup in the US that incentivizes the use of the cheapest product. And we often don't have any clarity at all, especially for the patients, on who's paying what for which, and their copay doesn't go down through the use of the cheaper product. And to be fair, unlike with generic drugs, the originators have competed on price such that when the biosimilar becomes available, the price of the originator drops too. So we need biosimilars within the healthcare system to reduce the prices. But as a biosimilar sponsor, you need to actually be able to gain market share. And that's where we've got some major hiccups, even in cases where we say have 10 biosimilars entering the market, and they still have a nominal part of that market share.
So you got, it's almost like a catch-22. You say, okay, well, you're a manufacturer, you're got your price at one level, biosimilar competition comes along, and you slash the price because your sunk costs have already been recovered. You slash your costs, maybe even to below what the biosimilar costs, and people say bravo. But if that continues, then there's not going to be any biosimilar competition in the future, right?
And we're seeing that with the 90%. So I think the writing is on the wall, and then you add to that the Inflation Reduction Act, where you've essentially got a price control on the reference product, even if a biosimilar is in the pipeline, and it obviously makes it very, very difficult. It's not a competitive market in any shape or form that's transparent or free at the moment in the US, and the US matters to the world.
So that's where I wanted to go next, is the IRA, the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program. When Congress created it, they actually thought about biosimilars. They thought they were helping to preserve biosimilar competition. They said, the price negotiation, some people call it price setting, isn't going to kick in if there's biosimilar competition or if there's imminent biosimilar competition, and so the biosimilar wouldn't have to compete against a price controlled a price that's been controlled by Medicare or negotiated by Medicare. It would compete against the price that was in the marketplace. Why isn't that working?
Well, number one, if you're within 2 years of a biosimilar, when you've got a 7 to 10 year development time, obviously that was a little bit of a misfit in terms of changing expectations for the biosimilars.
So stop right there just to explain that. So basically what the law says is that a drug won't be subject to Medicare price negotiation if there's a biosimilar that's going to be on the market within 2 years, right? But you're saying that the biosimilars
something like that, but
yeah,
you've already started development 8, 10 years ago.
7 years earlier. Yeah, so how could you know? Yeah.
So I think, but also I think if you go all the way back to BPCIA, the law in 2010 that created the pathway, it was the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act. The whole idea was free market competition. And if you've changed the rules very late in development, that is another encumbrance on the biosimilar that your innovator product you're competing against has some level of reduction. Of course, we don't know what it is. And as we go through the years, more and more of the originator products are going to be swept up in the price controls because they won't have had a biosimilar in development within the 2 years. So it just adds a tremendous layer of unpredictability and complexity to what is the commercial space that you're trying to introduce your biosimilar into. And I think, as you know, anything that's not business certainty is very, very difficult if you're trying to maintain investment and you're trying to maintain sustainability of a certain business model that has suddenly changed.
Well, and there's another wrinkle in the IRA, which I think is interesting, which is even if a biosimilar launches against a product that's had its price negotiated, the law says that plans have to provide access to the originator product, which has had the price negotiated. It doesn't say they have to provide access to the biosimilar. So in that way, it could even disadvantage biosimilars.
Yes, and I think all of these aspects become immensely complicated. So if we go all the way back to how we get biologics in the first place, that law is a paragraph, right? Safe, pure, and potent, made in a licensed facility. Then we got BPCIA that enabled biosimilars, but it's like 40 or 50 pages with all these patent things. And then we have IRA on top. So just the level of uncertainty becomes immense. So even if we got what I wanted on streamline development, we got rid of the inappropriate comparative efficacy studies, we half the price, we half the time, the incentives ultimately have to come from the market. There has to be a pull through. There has to be adoption. And then we've got every therapeutic area behaving differently. So this is where we're seeing collectively a lot of companies are not persisting with biosimilar development. Part of that void, so-called void of the 90% of products with no biologics in development, are showing how different it is from generics. In a generic drug situation, we expect there will be at least one generic to pretty much any successful innovative drug. We've already got the message that's not happening in the biologic space. So I think we have to look very carefully at the data in front of us and say, have we designed a system that is going to encourage biosimilars for the long term? And a lot of it has to be on this commercial space. We have to have predictability and pull through and adoption. And that is very gray. And then in the US, we're 4% of the world's population. We're about 60% of the market. There's obviously questions on the R&D side, but there's also questions on the pricing side. Because if the US can't succeed, it becomes a very big question as whether the rest of the world succeeds, particularly those countries that may not even be able to pay cost of goods, let alone the cost of development itself. And they tend to become, therefore, secondary markets. So I think the data's in front of us. And we as a society can make a choice as to whether we're going to encourage biosimilars or not.
So one of the other, you just mentioned the global aspect of it. So one of the other things that's really on the table, on the agenda in Washington these days, is what the Trump administration calls most favored nation, which is really international reference pricing. I've talked to a lot of people, including on this podcast, about the impact of most favored nation policies on innovative products, but they would also have impacts on biosimilars, right? And I think at least in two dimensions. One is the pricing of the biosimilar itself, and the other, of course, is that if you have a slowdown in the development of original products, then you're not going to have biosimilars because biosimilars are based on original products. But let's go to the first one. MFN for biosimilars. If the United States were to say, okay, well, we're not going to pay more than what any OECD country pays, maybe adjusted for GDP or whatever, for a biologic or a biosimilar, what would that mean? What would that do?
The irony of that question is, are we going to put the generic prices up in the US because we have such a successful market in generic small molecule drugs in the US, where we have more rapid adoption and lower prices than everybody else? So I think the danger on this, and I'm not an economist, is the inconsistency of the arguments. Because if indeed we want to pay less for the brands, which we tend to get first, we pay more for, but then the price drops more quickly when we get generics, there's a whole bigger ecosystem to being considered. And it's the same with the importation arguments, which are, along the similar lines, is we keep on adding complexity to the system. Instead of saying, wait a minute, we've got a product that is the same in terms of clinical outcomes, costs less, shouldn't we use it? And so I agree the science is the easy bit, not trivial, but it's easy. On the economics, we need to go back to first principles. The US is about free market competition. And if that system was transparent, I think we would get what we've got with generic small molecule drugs, where we lead the world with adoption. So we have to look at what's in the way of adoption fundamentally. And I don't think MFN is going to be an easy way to go there any more than importation is.
And so one of the things that when I think about MFN, I think, there's more than one European country, I believe, that uses a tender system for biosimilars, for biologics in general, and specific for biosimilars, where basically whoever's willing to give the lowest price, in some cases it's winner take all, or some cases they have, the winner takes most and some other player gets part of the market. But that drives things down to the bottom, but it also drives everybody else out of it, right? Out of the market, except for the one that wins the tender. If we kind of adopt those tactics in the United States through MFN, in the short term, we're going to lower the prices dramatically. But in the long term, to what you're speaking about, what does that do for the sustainability of a market?
It kills it. So I think that's where Europe is very interesting. As I like to say, it's only 27 countries with only 23 official languages. And some of those countries never had the reference. But because, particularly in Eastern Europe, but because of the centralized approval, they get access to the biosimilar, having never had the reference. And some of them, like the Scandinavian countries, have been experimenting at various levels, small countries, they're centralized systems with these multi-tender systems. And then the UK, obviously no longer in Europe, but the UK has experimented with a system where they give a proportion of the market based on the price offered, but everybody gets some aspect of the market. So I think there's recognition within Europe that winner takes all, even if they've got multiple markets with all the individual countries, is not the way to go. Now, how they then solve it, particularly when we've got other issues emerging like tariffs and other levels of uncertainty, is not clear. But I think Europe is confronting the problem that they can't have crash to the bottom, because then they're going to have no products.
So then, yeah, and you just said the magic word of what I wanted to ask you about next, tariffs. What does tariffs do? What would the imposition of tariffs do to the biosimilars market? Your company obviously manufacturers in South Korea. Other biosimilars manufacturers manufacture around the world. Even the ones that manufacture in the United States have to have components that come from overseas. What would tariffs do to the economics of biosimilars?
Another massive layer of uncertainty. And of course, building a quality facility to make these quality assured, safe and effective products is not an overnight job. And we've learned that with hurricanes coming through in the US, even when we've got an excess of capacity. It comes down to surety of supply. It comes down to the lessons we learned from COVID, that we have a global industry, different stages are done in different places as we seek this efficient model. And if we can't be efficient, then we're not going to have competitive prices. So the industry itself is concentrated on efficiency because that's how they're able to compete. So to me, everything comes back to this free market competition, because then the industry is incented to be efficient and have the surety of supply. We could just have the brand, have no biosimilars at all. The challenge with that, though, is if something happens to a critical facility, the entire supply chain is disrupted. And we've been seeing that with some generics. If they get too cheap, then you can't upgrade facilities, you can't make the investment, and you can't maintain the supply. So I would like to learn the lessons from drug shortages, from hurricanes, that you need redundancy in the system, but you need redundancy within an efficient system that we're prepared to pay for. And then we will make the products.
And that implies global manufacturing, because you can't have the kind of resiliency that you're talking about if you have all of your manufacturing eggs in one basket, right?
And it facilitates global access, because you want that efficiency to enable more jurisdictions to be able to afford these absolutely fantastic drugs. I mean, no question. But they also need the infrastructure to use them appropriately. If you're talking oncology, you need the hospitals and the diagnosis, and there's a whole bunch of other things. Drugs are a critical part of the healthcare system, 10% or something, but they're not healthcare as a whole. They've got to be used appropriately. And unfortunately, for a lot of the countries, they don't have the infrastructure to appropriately use these biologics. But you can prevent disease with them. So I think access earlier, say in some of the degenerative diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, has to be what we're all shooting for. And we can do that if it's cheaper. And the UK showed they can treat more people with a cheaper product. Even if the net cost doesn't save them that much money in the end, you're actually treating more people. So the opportunity is right in front of us. The data is right in front of us. Time to use it.
Great. Well, thanks. That's actually a very good way to end it. I think we've sketched out what the challenges are. We sketched out some of the solutions, and there's a lot at stake. So let's stay in touch and hope some of this actually works out, and we get that promise that I mentioned at the beginning of the show of greater development of biosimilars, greater uptake of biosimilars, feeding into more innovation and more headroom for paying for innovation.
Thank you. We have the answers. Let's apply them.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Gillian.
Thanks.
Brought to you by the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, debuting in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.